play, and everyone did what was expected of them. Life was tough. Living conditions were diabolical. Damp walls and an outside toilet were the least of it, as often there was just a single cold tap in the kitchen and no electricity upstairs. Although it's hard to believe now, it wasn't unknown for a family of 7 or more to occupy a couple of damp rooms in a house, with smaller children sleeping on truckle beds beside their parents and older children top to tail in double beds. However, these were our streets, and they were where we belonged. I grew up through the 50s, when the old Victorian houses were being swept aside to make way for high-rise blocks with indoor toilets and modern kitchens. But even when we were moved into flats and maisonettes on new council estates, the spirit of the old streets remained. Children played on concrete landings instead of cobbles, and women gossiped at the top of the stairwell rather than on street corners, but the sense of community was the same. So what does it mean to be an East Ender? It means a no-nonsense attitude, an understanding that you have to make your own opportunities, as no one is going to hand you them on a plate. It's knowing that you've come from a long line of survivors who have overcome disadvantage and poverty, scorn and oppression, to make a better life for themselves and their family. It's knowing you belong to a special breed, and that no matter how far you travel or how high you rise in life, the invisible mantle of being an East Ender stays wrapped around you. Many of the streets I knew as a child have long been swept away, and life has distanced me from my old haunts. But that doesn't matter. Being an East Ender is more than coming from a place on the map, or even the way you talk. Being an East Ender is in your very marrow and your heart, until it beats its last beat. Chapter 1. Our House. In 1954, the people of Britain had 2 reasons to rejoice. Firstly, after 14 long and tedious years, wartime rationing had finally ended. And secondly, I entered the world, bright and early on an August bank holiday. 2 weeks later, my parents left the hospital with me and took me to my first home, a one-up, one-down cottage at 71 Anthony Street. It was situated on the Chapman Estate, a self-contained area to the south of the renowned commercial road, which included the infamous Watney Street Market. There were 2 churches nearby, the Catholic St Mary's and the C of E Christ Church, something to cater to every spiritual need. The streets on the Chapman Estate had names like Jane, Martha, Richard, and our own Anthony Street. Lined by workers' cottages on both sides, the street had existed since the 18th century. It had been built cheaply to house Victorian labourers and had no foundation, no damp course, and, as I'll get to later, no indoor bathroom. You entered the 15 by 15 foot parlour from the front door straight off the street. At the back was a small scullery that also served as our kitchen. The cottage had a beaten earth floor. The lounge was covered by brown lino. There was just enough room to squeeze in a 2-seat sofa, a couple of fireside armchairs, and a rag rug in front of the cast-iron grate. The single bedroom above could be reached by climbing the narrow wooden stairs that ran up the side of the lounge. Still, half the housing stock in East London had been destroyed or damaged beyond repair thanks to the Blitz. I know my parents were thankful to have their own home, not least because they'd been living cheek by jowl with my grandparents for the past 6 years in a 3-bedroom mid-terrace home in Ilford. This kind of arrangement was very common. I had several friends at senior school who lived with their grandparents well into the 1970s. For reasons I'll explain a little further on in my tale, by the time I was born, my father's eldest sister, Nell, had become my mother's father's second wife, thereby making her both my aunt and my grandmother. The cottage was just a few streets away from the house where my father had been born in 1917, and where his parents and older brother Jimmy still lived. His eldest brother Arthur, his wife, and my cousin Edie lived a few doors down from us, and his younger sister, my Aunt Martha, lived around the corner in Planet Street, alongside half a dozen Fullerton cousins. My great-great-grandparents had walked these streets too in their day, and even lived in some of the same houses. Although we had electricity, to save money on a fine day, once the morning chores were done, women would take a chair and sit alongside their front doors to knit, sew, or gossip in the street. Today, no one would dream of letting their children...